Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs and my name is Deepak. Here in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about some of the configuration file of PWA. And this chapter is going to be very important and very interesting for all the UI developer out there. The reason why I'm saying this is going to be very interesting is that because we are going to be practically changing some of the config files, we are going to be building the application over and over again, and we will try to run that in the browser. But I want to bring your attention to a very crucial aspect of PWA, which is the service worker lifecycle. And post that, we will talk about how this service worker works otherwise. Since this tutorial is focused specifically on Angular, so we are not going to be touching upon other libraries out there where using which you could create a PWA yourself. We are just going to be focusing on the Angular CLI and files and codes which are generated out of an Angular CLI and ngadd command that we have also seen running in the last script. We had touched upon all the basic files which got generated last time, which is the ngsw-config.json, and we also spoke about the manifest file. We also spoke about the new library which got added, and we also saw how the service worker file got generated in the dist folder and so on and so forth. So all of those things, the basic ones, are already done. Now we are going to be deep diving into ngsw-config.json, and also going to be talking about the service worker lifecycle. So before I go further, I would want to take you to the Chrome, and here I have the Angular documentation available for service worker overview. And in that, we have already seen the overview, the getting started guide also, we have covered pretty much all. Now, next thing is the configuration file. So configuration file precisely revolves around the configuration of ngsw-config.json. So you may have noticed that initially when we generated the build application, that's when the service worker file or service worker.js file was getting generated. However, prior to that, whenever we added a PWA support in our application, the ngsw config.json was the only thing available. There was no service worker file per se, right? So how this service worker file is generated is through ngsw-config.json. So configuration that you define inside it, basis that it generates the service worker file, and that's what it keeps it in the dist folder. So this is all about the theory. And now before I take you to the code and start deep diving and changing, and we start changing the configuration file, I also want to start the application in the localhost 8080 port. There is this HTTP server available in our code base as well, using which we will run this distributed folder. We will run the generated folder, and for that, let me take you to my VS Code, and then we will get inside the dist folder and we'll try to run it. So you may have noticed that initially while we were building the application, I had also installed HTTP-server. Right? The HTTP-server is precisely used to basically host the file generated file locally. So here is the hosted file, as you can see inside the browser. So let me open another shell here. So let me split this into two. And now let me clear this, and then HTTP server. All right, so now it's running on 8080. Now let me quickly take you to my browser and see if things are working. And there you go. Now you can see that the local host 8080 is working, right? And then if you also notice over here, there is a little icon which says install the app, right? And we are not going to be installing the app in this episode, and we are going to be practically changing certain things in the future in the advanced part of a PWA, but then we'll just try to focus currently on the config file that we have just generated from the Angular CLI. So let's not install it for now, and then let me just change a few things and I'll come back to it, right? So, but before I go to the code, let me just bring your attention to network tab, right? So let me just close everything up and refresh this. It'll take a moment to load the page, and if you may notice here in the size column of your browser, you may notice that a lot many things are coming from service worker. So service worker, memory cache, service worker, and then these three requests are coming from memory cache, and then again service worker, and then so on and so forth, right? So now let me take you to the application tab over here. So application, and then here is the service worker. Now you can see that the application is running properly and the service worker is registered. So now you look at these things. It says update network request unregister, And there are some of the options available from the Chrome browser using which you can actually test your service worker pretty neatly, right? So let me just make it an offline first and then bring your attention to network tab. Let me close everything up and then refresh the page. Again, if you notice, all of these have come back, right? The only thing is that the teacher's profile API has failed because we have made it offline. And then again, ngsw.json, which was generated after we build the application, is also not coming in because because there is no network connectivity. However, the skeleton of your application is available. The skeleton of this application is also known as app shell. And what is the idea behind app shell? That's something which we would come to later. Service worker is essentially storing all these details in the cache. So when I speak about cache, let's just quickly have a look if it is really the case, if it is really storing anything or not, right? So here is the cache storage, and if you just open it over here, you will notice that, let me expand it a little bit more. Now you may notice that it is coming from the localhost 8080, and then it says ngsw, and there is a big hash number over here. And then it says assets app cache, assets app meta, assets meta, right? So first it has the cache, then it has a meta, and then it has the assets cache, and then it has a meta. So basically your service worker has created 5 such entries over here. 1 2 3 4 5. First is the db, and if you look at it over here in the db.control, you may notice that you have some of these available, right? So it stores the text plain character, the assignment. So the details of it would be available somewhere here, right? And then you say latest also, it has all of this available. Then you say manifest, in the manifest service worker tab once again, and then let's just unregister it, right? So now we have unregistered, and you may also notice that the moment we unregister it, all these 3 options have become disabled. That's number 1. Number 2 is you also notice that the status #319 activated has and is stopped. This is activated but stopped. If you look at further in this section, which is the update cycle, it says install, wait, and activate, right? So what is install, what is wait, and what is activate? To know more about this, let me just quickly take you to an MDN website, and then they open the service worker documentation up here, right? So you may notice that service worker has a life cycle. So the moment service worker request is placed, right? So the first event that happens in the service worker scope is basically called install. So in order to make service worker available, and in order for your service worker to start rendering the assets and start caching the caching the assets and the responses, it needs to be activated first or installed first before it gets activated, right? So that's why the first event of it is install. The other one is a wait event, and then it waits for a while until it gets activated, and activated it's something. The moment it gets activated, it is then starts to render all your application from there, right? And there are many other nuances to the service worker lifecycle, and which we'll come to a little while later. But let me just refresh the page and just notice what happens to these three tab icons over here, these 3 tab buttons over here, right? So let me just refresh this. There you go. Since we have made the app offline, it did not now render it. Why it did not render it? Because we have unregistered the service worker. Let me make it online once again, or uncheck the offline tab and then refresh it, and then just wait for a moment, and then it will show you what it is really. So now if you notice here, it says 320 activated and is running, right? Now you have an option to stop it. All these options become enabled, and the application, you can see, is being rendered on your browser very happily. No problem with it, right? Similarly, if you notice, the number previously was 319, and this time around it has become 320. So it basically keeps the particular number is generated by the browser. It keeps a track of what has really changed in the service worker code, and what if there is any change, it tries to make a request to bring it back, right? And how does it determine if things have changed? It basically generates a SHA number, which is a hash key that we had been seeing while looking at the dist folder. You may have noticed that main folder or polyfill or your CSS file actually was appended with one SHA number, or one big hex number, right? So that hex number is the one which determines which version of application is being run on your browser. So now we have spoken about all these buttons and things. We've also spoken about the lifecycle of service worker, and everything is fine so far. Now let me take you to the code and bring your focus to ngsw-config.json. Right? So this ngsw-config.json is a file which determines how your application assets and app content would be cached in your browser and how they would be rendered. And what I mean by this last statement is that when I say how it will be rendered, what I mean is how your application would make a call to the HTTP request and how it would bring the response and how it would really render it, either the network first only or only the cache or cache only or network only or a mix and match of both of these conditions, right? So we have already seen that asset groups is basically an array object. Inside an array object, we can determine that app and assets is what we have currently determined. Currently, it's only the app and the assets which gets rendered, which is basically provided to your service worker file, and that's something which it keeps a track of and would basically render your assets and things accordingly, right? So first thing in this file is the schema. The next field is index. So index essentially means is that the start of file, usually it is always the index.json, but index.html, but just in case in your browser, if you want to change this to, let's say, app.html, right? In that case, you would have to change this to app.html. The idea of index file in the config.json is to basically determine which is the starting point of your application, and precisely it's going to be by default index.html, but it is always you're always allowed to change it in case if you have a separate need. So the next thing we're going to be talking about the assets group. I think we have already briefly talked about the assets group in the previous two episodes, but then let me just bring your attention to two important aspects. Now, if you notice here, it says the install mode, right? And then if you see, the first one is the prefetch, the other one is the lazy. You see, the install mode has two values for these two different objects. So what do you mean by lazy and what do you mean by prefetch, right? So this is very important. So just in case, this is very important aspect to understand, right? And that determines how your application as resources and assets are cached. To explain this a little bit further, let me take you to the Chrome browser and precisely the Angular documentation, and it has a very good documentation and detail available around this particular thing that you can very well read and become an expert into. So here on the browser, you will notice that it has a description of ngsw-config.json that we've already spoken about. The thing that I want to bring your attention to is this particular interface. So this is the interface for assets group. The assets group which we had just recently seen in the config.json file, which has a few properties: the name, the install mode, the update mode, the resources, and cache query options. We have spoken about name. We have also spoken about the index, right? And we have also spoken about the assets group. Assets group, we had currently created two assets group: the app assets group and then the assets asset group, right? So it is you can basically define many more such things in your config file. But then the important part is the install mode and update mode. As you may notice that install mode and update mode, both of them have two properties. It can possibly have these two properties, which is prefetch and lazy. So what happens in case of prefetch? What happens in case of lazy? So please pay attention to this particular point over here. Prefetch tells the Angular service worker to fetch every single listed resources while it's caching the current version of the application. This is a bandwidth intensive, but ensure resources are available whenever they are requested, even if the browser is currently offline. So it essentially means that in case if you want to load everything upfront, this is the strategy that you would have to go with, which is a prefetch. As the definition also implies that anything if you bring that into the prefetch category, it is going to be the intensive operation for your application, meaning that the moment it finds prefetch, it tries to bring back all the resources. The other thing is the lazy. So which means that it does not really cache any of the resources upfront. Instead, the Angular service worker only caches resources for which it is requested. This is an on-demand caching mode. Resources that are never requested are never cached. This is useful for thinking like images, different resolution. So the service worker only caches the correct assets for the particular screens and orientation. Okay. All right. So similarly, for the update mode also, we have two options, which is prefetch and lazy. And if you go back to the config.json, you would realize that. Let me take you the code again. And here you have not really seen that config.json entry just yet, right? So let me just bring that up here. Okay. If you look closely, you would realize that we have not really made any entry for the API calls up here, right? So all the API calls, you don't find any of the entry here, and that's what essentially we are trying to make right now. So to have this, we really need to include another object property, which is called data groups, right? So let me write down that. You see data groups, and in data groups it is going to be an array of multiple objects. I'm right to be hosting two APIs in here, right? The first API is, let's say, subjects API. If you remember that in our application we have 4 different subjects, right? So first one I'm going to be caching is the subjects API. There are essentially 4 subjects over there, and then I'm not really going to be caching all the APIs in here, and essentially going to be just making use of 2, and or rather let me make it just 1 for now, right? And then we will try to modify this bit a little while later, right? So for the subjects API, I'm going to be hosting, or rather putting, a few URLs in here. So what are those URLs? The first one is going to be for the maths, and then the other one is going to be for chemistry. So let me just put this maths and chemistry URLs in here. And the property is URLs, right? So that's done here. So now, using the data groups, it is going to be essentially caching 2 different APIs under the name of subjects API. But this is not important. The other thing which is very important is the cache config, and that's something which we are going to be talking about now. Let's say if we wish to store these APIs for a shorter duration, as in there has to be a mechanism to only cache the responses for a certain duration of a time, right? And why am I saying this? Because assume that you have maths and chemistry being cached right now, and then you're continuously making change in your backend code as well. At some point, you would really want your API to bring in the new response. So periodically, it is a good practice to really keep a check on how long your API responses would be cached, right? So in order to do this, we really need to define a config, which is called cache config, as you can see over here. And then in the cache config, I'm going to be defining a max age. So max age is, okay, now let me take you back to VS Code, and I'll show you what max age and other parameters are. So if you come down here, so there's going to be data group, and in data group cache config, there's going to be max age and max size. So what are the max age and max size? So if you look here, let's say if you only want to cache your response for 2 days, so you would actually have to write 2D. As for an example, you can see how Angular has provided an example of, let's say if you wish to cache your app response just for probably an hour, or let's say 2 hours, so you would define 2h. Let's say if you wish to define or to keep the cache responses just for 2 minutes, then you would write 2 minutes, 2m, right? And same goes for the timeout, meaning let's say if a timeout occurs, so when should your application understand that it should not really wait for the response, and it must time out and provide you the cache response. So let's say if you want to keep a certain parameter or certain check in your application, that let's say for some reason your API backend is getting slower, and then you wish to really load the API response as quickly as possible. And in case if the API response is not getting available in a particular stipulated period of time, you would want to show the cached response. For that, you will have to define the timeout. So both these properties are basically part of the interface called data group, and then data group is something that we are changing currently. So now let me go back to VS Code, and we have provided a data group cache config max age, let's say 2 hours, and then after every 2 hours, it'll make a new request, and then it'll try to bring in the response, right? So the next one is, let's say, timeout. For the timeout, let me bring 3 minutes. So I'll write down 3M. The other property important for this is the max size. Max size, again, I think we can live with it. Like I don't think so. Max size is a problem currently in our application, which is very small application. We barely have a few KBs of data. So let's just skip this. The other one is the cache opaque response property, right? So which is, let me write it down first. So cache opaque response. So before we understand cache opaque responses, we must understand what opaque responses are first place, right? So if you notice, in case of fetch, there are 3 types of responses a browser can request, which is the basic, coarse, and opaque. So opaque response is a response in which you define the response type as opaque. When you define a response type as opaque, your browser cannot really see what is the status code and the response. So assume a situation when your browser is unable to determine the status or the response. In that case, it is very difficult to cache such resources. If you cache this resource, you would understand that, let's say if you're in case of opaque response and your response comes out as 401 or any other error, in that case, since your browser is unable to determine it, the same response would be cached in your browser for your application, which would result in incorrect response every time your user is trying to open it in the cache. So it is very important to understand that in case of opaque responses, the strategy for caching has to be changed. Angular documentation, and let's understand what it says. So when you are defining an opaque response, it is the strategies for the opaque responses are freshness and performance, and then the default value is true, and the service worker caches opaque responses. These groups will request the data every time and only fall back to the cache response when offline or in a slow network. Therefore, it doesn't really matter if service worker cache and error responses. So you understand what I mean, right? So opaque response is a response in which your browser cannot really determine what kind of status message it has received or the data it cannot read. So in that case, you don't really know if it is caching a response. In that case, it is always a freshness which is recommended. In case of performance, the default value is false. In our case, we have provided it as a false, so which means that it is not really going to be storing any of the opaque responses, right? So whenever you find an opaque response, it will just be fresh all the time, right? So or freshness first strategy in that case. So now we have defined the opaque as well. Now just look at, I think max size we have already spoken about that we are going to be including. So let me just save this and try to run this. Okay. So cache config and precisely the data groups, you can define a lot of various different objects. And then currently we are just focusing on these two APIs, which is maths and chemistry. Configuration file and cache query options. Now, cache query options are the options that are used to modify the matching behavior of requests. They are passed as a browser cache match function. Currently, only the following options are supported: ignore search, ignore query parameter, defaults to false. So what it essentially means is, let now to understand that in a better way, let's just take you to the code. So for example, these are the two APIs that we have requested, right? Now let's say in our if the API that we have requested also accepted a query parameter in, let's say, student's name as John, right? And in this case, let's say if we provide the cache query option, right? So if, and the default value for this cache query option is false, meaning it will basically ignore everything after question mark, and it is not really going to be caching the response. So if your cache query response is set to false, so student's name John, and then let's say student's name Papa, both of them will have the same response, since these two are now different, these two, because we have set the cache query option as false, right? So how do we set the cache query option as false? So we'll have to come here and then put a comma and cache query options, ignore search, and then let's just make it as false. In this case, anything after the question mark would be ignored. And in our case, we don't really have the question mark. So I'm just going to be removing this as is over here. And I think that's pretty much it about the config file. And with this, since we have made a lot of changes in here, it's recommended to build an application to run it in the port 8080. But before that, let me take you quickly back to the Chrome and show you how our application works currently at port number 8080. So if you see here, in case of network tab, it's online at this moment. And if I limit this to fetch XHR, you see that all of these are 200 and they are only the one which is coming from the service worker, but then otherwise, and then let's say if we click here, it takes a while and then brings back the response. You go back here, similarly, all of these, although coming from, it is also caching in the service worker, right? But then actually making a call from the API. And then you can see that the teacher's profile, there are two such responses, right? Teacher's profile, service worker, first entry, second entry is basically when it caches it. So basically, this is going to be a fresh response every time you change it, right? So let's just go back to the application, and this is the landing page. And let me take you back to the code, and now we'll try to basically generate the build. So to build this, npm run build is the command. So just hold for a moment, and once this builds, I'll resume the video tutorial. All right, so the application has finished building it. And now let me just quickly take you to the Chrome browser and have a look at the application. So here is the application which is running. So let me close everything up and refresh this page right here. And before that, let me take you to the application tab, and then we can see that it is 320 which is activated and so on and so forth. So let me bring this here. The number for the service worker is still 320, something which we had changed, we had installed the last time. So let me do an unregister, right? And then now, since it has stopped, and let me refresh this bit here. So now it's a 321, and let me quickly go to the network tab, and then you can see the teacher's profile and ngsw-config.json has come online. So let me close everything up and let me click on maths, right? So it has gone here, go back, let me click on maths again. Now, if you notice, I've just made one request over here, right? So why it is so? It is this because we have now really changed the way in which it used to render, and since we have cached this response, so maths is coming from the cache response, and it will expire after 2 minutes at the time that we had defined over there in the configuration file. Basis that it will make another request in case if that condition fulfills, right? So now let me quickly click on the chemistry. Now again, since it's the first time it has cached it, now go back and click chemistry again. There you go. You would notice that you have the status as 200 and it is coming from service worker, and the time taken is 35 milliseconds only, or 34 milliseconds only for that matter. So let me go back here and click on physics, right? So it's 41 milliseconds. Let me close this, go back again and click on physics again. Now again, you would notice that it is basically making an API call every time we hit on physics. However, for maths and chemistry, it is bringing the cache response. So let me click on the application tab and open the cache resources. So here, let me take you to the assets and app assets precisely. So here, this is fine, this is a response. There you go. So if you look at the name over here, which is data subjects API and cache. The subjects API is the one that we had defined in the config file. So it is basically going to be storing everything under the subjects API inside the ngsw-config.json. Let me take you there. Now, if you notice again, so it's a data group. Under data group, there is a subjects API. Let's say if I were to determine it another one. So let's say make it as subjects APIs 2, save it, and let's say make it for physics, and remove this. Everything else remains same. Save it, and I'm also need to build the application once again. It'll take a moment, and then once it builds, we'll go back to browser and try to see if there is another entry being made with the subjects API 2 name, right? So let's just hold for a while until this gets installed. All right, the application has finished building. Let me take you to the Chrome browser, and here in the Chrome browser, let me close this, and rather click on the service worker. It is 321. Let me refresh this. Still it is 321. So let me unregister it and then refresh this bit. Now it's 322. It's registered again. And let me take you to the network tab. Here in the network tab again here. So the new subject that we had added was physics. So let me click on it. First time it makes a call and then it caches it. Next time if I click on physics again, you would notice that it's just one request that it's trying to make. So let me take you to the application tab, and here you may now notice that subjects API 2 is also created, wherein subjects API 2 is also created, where it is basically keeping the physics response, and the physics response is basically of type application JSON. The content over here is available. The time cache is again another header that you would that you can see and determine that how long this cached response would stay in the browser, right? So it's pretty much simple. So as you can see, the time of recording this video, it's basically 5:07 in the evening of 18th of February 2024. So now you may understand that what each and every one of these is all about. So right, so let's just click here. It's exactly the response which it is trying to store. So now let me quickly take you back to the VS Code. And here in the VS Code, now we have finished the data group. So let me just quickly delete this object because we don't really need it per se. And then the moment you delete it, you must ensure that every time you delete it, you must build your application once again. And in order to build your application once again, you really need to run the command ng build. And once you build it, it'll build the application. It'll change the hash file. Just wait for a moment. Once this builds, I can show you that the hash file also changes the name, right? So which means that even if a byte of a change is recognized by the service worker would update the service worker file, right? Even if there is a difference of a byte, just try and understand, even if you put a space mark over there in the service worker file or in any of your application, it'll rebuild and it'll redeploy it, and the caching would really take place once again, right? So that's pretty much it about ngsw-config.json. We have detailed we have just a deep dive into what these things are: the data sets group, the data group, and each and every of this property. And we had also seen that in the service worker there are basically three life cycles. There are three life cycle events basically. The activated is the last one, the second last is the wait, and then the first is installing, right? So install, activate, and activate. So that's pretty much it about that's all for this particular video tutorial, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really glad that you're spending your time doing something meaningful, which is basically learning things with me. So if you are liking my work, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also hit the bell icon so you would be notified every time I create a new video and post it online. Meanwhile, if you have any feedback suggestions, please do write down in the comment section below. I'll be more than happy to incorporate your changes and your suggestions. And in case if you want me to focus on a particular technology in the future and build a video tutorial around it, please do write down in the comment section below. I'll definitely I would love to create such video tutorials for you all. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. And it's an absolute pleasure to host this video tutorial for you all. Thank you once again, and I'll see you in the next one.